I'm Chance Storland, and this is the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from ExpressNews.com, and I'm joined once again by San Antonio Express News sports writer Mike Finger. Mike, the Spurs just started off that Rodeo road trip with a loss. What are your thoughts on that 112-127 game against Sacramento?
Well, it wasn't the most surprising thing in the world after a week at home, starting this trip, having to go out and play a team that's really improved, the Sacramento Kings, without Derek White on the floor, who's been either the third or the second best Spurs player over the past month or so, depending on how you're looking at it. So there was a lot of ways that game was kind of set up for the Spurs to fail. And when you look at the way this road trip is set up, you know, there could be a lot of that on this trip. But the first month of this season was about collecting, or the first month of this calendar year was about setting up things for success. I mean, there was a lot of built-in advantages that the Spurs had with the schedule, and now that is going to start to catch up with them. And we've talked about this a lot this year. This is a team that is kind of middle of the pack in the West. It's not a team that is by most accounts competing for a championship. So the way the ebb and flow of the season works for a team like this is you take advantage of the weak spots in the schedule, and then you're going to have to take your lumps. And right now, this could be starting a point when the Spurs might have to take a few lumps.
Now, obviously, this year is quite different than the last season for lots of different reasons. But how would you say this rodeo road trip compares to the recent past? We'll talk more about Derek White. There's been problems with DeMar DeRozan. LaMarcus Aldridge has been playing well as of late. When you put all that together, what are your thoughts on this road trip?
Well, historically, going back to when the AT&T Center was opened back in the 2003 season, that's when the rodeo trip kind of started out of necessity, and that became a point, as most Spurs fans know, the point in the season when the team really kind of gelled and used that as an opportunity to become whatever that season Spurs were going to be. They came together on the road, and what people thought before the arena opened would be a huge disadvantage for the Spurs in terms of having to be on the road for 3 weeks became kind of the rallying point for them. And that was when Tim Duncan was around, when Manu Ginobili was around, when Tony Parker was around. It hasn't worked quite that way in recent years. There haven't been disastrous road trips, but it's been a bit tougher for younger teams to navigate that. And now with the team the way it is, you know, I'm still not predicting that this rodeo trip will be disaster, but it's tough schedule-wise in terms of this first week especially. There was a Sacramento team that, like I mentioned before, is fighting for a playoff spot now and is vastly improved over the Sacramento teams in recent years. And then you have a Golden State and a Portland back-to-back. It's tough to deal with that. And, you wrap this up towards the end of it by going to Toronto, which is one of the better teams in the East, and obviously will be up for that game for a lot of non-standings reasons. So overall, this is one of the rougher road trips, and just in terms of the places they have to go. In terms of the schedule itself, in terms of the calendar, it's not like it used to be where you're on the road for 2 straight weeks and it's just one after another. There's kind of 3 this week, and then you come home and play Memphis for a game, and then you have that long all-star break between the first half and the second half. So really it's kind of 3 mini trips, but each of those mini trips has its own challenges. And for the Spurs to get through with maybe 2 or 3 victories during this might be an accomplishment that they cannot be too ashamed of.
Already mentioned Golden State. That game's tonight. DeRozan and Aldridge will not be playing. Tell me about that.
I mean, it's not the only surprising part of this is that it hasn't happened before. This is perfectly set up for a Spurs rest game. When you talk about, first of all, a game that the Spurs probably were not going to win anyway, even at full strength. The Warriors have become the Warriors again. This isn't like the Golden State team earlier this year that was kind of ragged and finding itself. The Warriors are the best team in the league again with DeMarcus Cousins back. So you take that, you take the fact that Aldridge and DeRozan both have been banged up lately and could use a night off, and then it's the first night of a back-to-back, and this was as obvious of a rest game as there can be in the reign of Greg Popovich. And so, I mean, you look at it, they were going to be huge underdogs anyway. They would like to win one of these next two games, or at least give them a shot, give themselves a shot to win one of these next two games. And if you're going to pick one or the other, you're going to try to win the Portland one on the second night of the back-to-back, and that will be difficult too. But again, DeMar DeRozan has been hitting those dog days of January and February that he's mentioned before. This is the time of year when the schedule kind of catches up with him, and he could use a night off. LaMarcus hasn't had one all season. He fought to play in New Orleans a couple of weeks ago when he had a wrist issue. He's fought through a lot of stuff this year because he wants to be out there. He's kind of been that guy for the Spurs this year. But if he fought to play tonight, he wasn't going to win that argument with Greg Popovich. They feel like they have a better chance to beat Portland than they do against Golden State, and I think everybody in the league would agree with that. They'll still be underdogs against Portland tomorrow, but this gives them a better chance to bring both those guys back refreshed.
You've already mentioned Derek White a bit. He was part of what I have dubbed here on the podcast the week of hell, with or about a week, whatever that was, that time span, with multiple injuries, injured again. He's really been crucial, really filled a nice role for the Spurs after his return. Tell me your thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, that's why him going down with this injury is such a big deal. He had been the guy that, last year spent a lot of time in the G League in Austin, kind of learning his craft. That's kind of what the Spurs do with their first year players these days, much to the chagrin of some fans who want to see rookies, in the NBA playing for the Spurs more often. But he is kind of the textbook case for how bringing a young player along slowly and kind of making them go through the steps can pay off. And you're right, he had been one of the huge success stories for the Spurs this year. The way that he, started out slowly, looked kind of overwhelmed in his first start, but then got his feet under him and really became not just a point guard to distribute to the stars, to DeMar DeRozan and LaMarcus Aldridge, but also became a guy who can get a shot himself, who can rebound, who can defend. I mean, losing DeJounte Murray before the year was the biggest hit to the Spurs defense that they could have taken. He was an all defensive player last year on the wing. And now Derek isn't quite playing at that level, but he's their best perimeter defender right now. And so you add all of that together, and it just makes it all the more frustrating for the Spurs that they're going to have to get through at least the first half of this rodeo road trip without him. And, speaking from personal experience, this plantar fascia injury that he has is just horribly frustrating. And I'm sure a lot of listeners have had that before in their lives. I mean, I had it a few years ago. It's an injury from overuse sometimes. Sometimes it's just a freakish thing that the doctors don't know where it came from. But, you wake up in the morning and your heel is burning and there's nothing you can do for it except for rest. Personally, I had it after running a long race, and it took me months to get over it. And that's I've had friends who've had it, and it's kind of the same thing. There's no quick fix for it. And so when you look at Derek, he was out with one foot to start the season, and now it's a second foot, and that kind of makes you scared a little bit. I know the Spurs trainers, the people who deal with Derek, were worried to start the year that if you bring him back too quickly, the injury can come back quickly. And I think people who have had plantar fascia injuries can attest to this, that you think you have it licked and you don't. And that's why the Spurs are going to err on the side of caution here and keep him out. They said for sure through this week. I would doubt that he'd play next week against Memphis, and maybe that's why this All-Star break could come at a good time, because if he's out that whole week too, then that gives him 3 weeks to kind of sit aside and get rested up for the season after the All-Star break. But I mean, getting him healthy is priority number one now for this team, because he's just been a dynamic playmaker in a lot of ways, and he's a key to this team. When DeMar DeRozan has been struggling, the last month or so, Derek White has been the team's second best player, and I think he can be that down the stretch if they just get him healthy.
So, Golden State tonight, DeMar DeRozan won't be playing, LaMarcus Aldridge won't be playing, then followed by Portland, Utah, Memphis, already mentioned a little bit earlier, Mike, on the 22nd, Toronto. Now, that meeting in San Antonio, I think, went really well. That was a fun game, very interesting time. DeMar DeRozan, I think, really wanted that victory. The Spurs really wanted that victory. But it's going to be very different when the Spurs travel to Toronto, because DeMar DeRozan is loved there, as opposed to a different situation for many when it comes for Kawhi Leonard in San Antonio. What are your thoughts on that game? What's that going to be like?
Well, it's the first game after the break, and it will be some of the rawness. I'm not sure if that is a word, of the whole Kawhi situation will at least be a little bit behind everybody after the two teams had already met in San Antonio. But it'll be a heavily anticipated game, just like the first one was. And being that there will be some buildup after the All-Star break, there's not going to be games the day before. People will be talking about it for days in advance, and it's just like that game in San Antonio was set up for the Spurs to win with the crowd against Kawhi, and the Spurs being fired up to play, the guy who demanded a trade from them. This is going to be the game where kind of everything is going to be on Toronto's side, and the professional athletes have pride in the situation, and it's a huge home court advantage in Toronto. So that I would not be surprised to see kind of just a whole reversal of outcomes in that situation. But it's so far down the road that we don't know who's going to be playing for either team at this point. That's a couple of weeks away, and injuries can happen. But in terms of, you mentioned the rest of the road trip, I think, as I alluded to earlier, people have to have just a little lower of a set of expectations for how this trip is going to unfold over the next few weeks, just because Derek White is not available for at least the next 2 or 3 games, maybe 4 games. And that swing after the All-Star break, Toronto, Brooklyn, New York Knicks on back-to-back nights. Those Toronto and Brooklyn games are easily losable, and most of these games in the first half are losable. So if you can get through it, like I said earlier, with 3 wins out of this whole trip, 4 wins would be a party. It's not going to be like the old days where the team just came together and Tim became Tim and Manu became Manu, and everything fell into place. It's going to be a struggle. The light at the end of the tunnel for this team is that once you get through this trip, and this has always been the case for the Rodeo road trip, that means you get to collect a bunch of home games afterwards in March and the beginning of April. And so one thing that just happened recently before we started recording this podcast, last night, the Clippers traded away Tobias Harris to Philadelphia. So the side effect of that for the Spurs is that that makes one less team kind of fighting for a playoff spot in the West. I don't think that the Clippers are what they were before this trade. So there's going to be some leeway there for the Spurs to hold on to that playoff berth. But it's going to be a struggle here through this road trip to kind of maintain the spot in the standings. And I think you kind of have to be patient and know that you'll be able to get a little bit of a rebound when they come home.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News sports writer Mike Finger for joining me for today's episode of the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.